Thank you, Speaker. I rise to address the appropriations bills for the 2020-21 budget. While I'll be supporting the bills and welcome the inclusion of some positive measures, like a new school for my electorate, I want to spend a little time on why I feel this budget is a bit disappointing overall. After listening to members' contributions on this, I'm getting the impression that the government's selling this budget on two key grounds. First, that we have lower debt than other states, and secondly, the handy campaign line that there are no new taxes. Now, this is almost funny because it quite neatly points to some of the biggest problems with Labor's approach. First, when they say no new taxes, what that really means is no new taxes for their mates in the banking and mining and property industries. When they say lower debts than other states, what that translates into is less investment in infrastructure, social services and job-creating projects than the other states. This budget, like every other budget, is about who gets what. And in Queensland, the property developers, big banks, multinational mining corporations get no new taxes, but ordinary people consistently get higher fees for health, transport and education, lower wages, fewer jobs and growing housing insecurity. The biggest failure of this budget is its failure to tackle the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of those mining corporations, big banks and property developers. Thermal coal is in decline and Queenslanders are losing royalties revenue. We could do so much more to expand the mining of those minerals we need for a massive renewables expansion and give ordinary people a fair share of the wealth that generates by raising royalties. Instead, Labor's frozen royalties to keep coal and gas on life support. There's no better example of why we need to take on big corporations rather than leaning on ordinary people than the sorry situation with Labor's health promises during this election. Now, Queensland has done a great job, a world-leading job, Acting Speaker, in suppressing COVID-19, thanks to our incredible frontline workers, the Chief Health Officer, and look, I'll say it again so there's no confusion, thanks to the government's leadership as well. Unfortunately, Labor is asking health workers to carry this huge load on our behalf while failing to support them. Before the election, they froze their wages right as we were tipping into a recession, and I was proud to stand here and vote against those measures, Acting Speaker. Then, during the election, the government proposed what sounded like a big expansion, thousands of extra frontline workers. In fact, they almost promised as many additional frontline workers as the Greens proposed in health. But then it all came unstuck, because it turns out, and this budget confirms, that their promise of 5,800 nurses, 1,500 doctors and 1,700 allied health professionals by 2024 is based on no new money. That means Queensland Health and our hospitals will need to cut $270 million of healthcare spending from their other work every single year. That's $1.08 billion over the next 4 years. I'll be talking to the nurses, the midwives and doctors in my electorate and beyond about how these cuts could affect their work. But what I want to ask the government is where exactly do they expect that money will come from? They'll demand the opposition outline their cuts to reduce debt, but dismiss the question themselves with glib promises of so-called efficiency savings. Frontline workers know what that means. Maybe it's fewer hospital parking concessions or less administrative, logistics, policy support, less of what they need to do their jobs. Especially during a pandemic, we should be giving them the resources they need, not asking them to do more with less. As my colleague, the member for South Brisbane, said in here on Tuesday, Queensland is a wealthy state, but we need to make sure that wealth is shared. There's a very similar story in education, Mr Acting Deputy. Yes, they are building new schools across Queensland and that is very welcome, but instead of taking on big mining corporations and raising the revenue we need, they're asking teachers to also do more with less. In particular, the flagship promise in the budget for 6,190 new teachers and 1,139 teacher aides over the next 4 years is actually funded from the existing Education Department budget. That means no new money. This one's truly puzzling because it's just not clear to me how they're planning to add more than 7,000 extra staff, very welcome extra staff, I should say, without spending any extra money. All this while Queensland is the worst state or territory in the nation at funding our public schools up to the national benchmark, the Schooling Resource Standard, or SRS. Instead of getting our public schools to 100% of the SRS by coughing up our state contribution of 80%, Queensland is stuck at 69%, with no increase to that proportion over the next 3 years. The Greens believe that we should fully fund our public schools, cut class sizes, abolish school fees for state schools and create free breakfast and lunch programs so that no child has to learn on an empty stomach. Once again, unless we make big corporations pay their fair share, we won't be able to provide the things every Queenslander needs to live a good life. And perhaps one of the most fundamental building blocks of a good life is a safe, secure home. But right now, tens of thousands of people in Queensland don't have that, and we can estimate, based on previous growth rates, that there are around 47,000 people on the social housing waiting list in Queensland, although I suspect we'll find it's more than that when the register for this last year is finally released. There has never been a better time to invest in social housing. The Victorian government acknowledged that when they announced a social housing stimulus package with their budget, and I'd hope to see Queensland Labor do the same and follow suit. But no, there is no new money for social housing in this budget, and the government plans to deliver just 470 social homes this year. Building homes for around 2% of the current waiting list is so absurd it almost obscures the gravity of this situation, that there are tens of thousands of real people registered and waiting for a home with no end in sight. In a wealthy state like Queensland, no one should be without a home, but instead of building more homes, Mr Speaker, they're building more prisons. As I've said in this place, I don't know how many times before, building new prisons will not fix overcrowding, and hiring more police will not make anyone safer. To build and operate the new and expanded prisons, the government is planning to spend more money than they'll spend on social housing. And yes, to clear this up, if the Treasurer is confused, that includes money on prisons, and they are prisons, for children as young as 10 years old. That's on top of their plan to spend $325 million on extra police. Now, keeping people, especially young kids, locked up does not solve the causes of crime, poverty and criminalisation. In fact, it traps more kids, disproportionately Indigenous kids, in a cycle of criminalisation. This should be a moment for boldness and to leave the old law and order politics behind. As we all saw, the electorate roundly rejected the LNP's shameful and racist policy for a youth curfew in Cairns and Townsville, and their scare campaign didn't work. That should be a sign to Labor that things need to change in Queensland. I'm reiterating the Greens' call for a moratorium on new prisons, both youth prisons and adult prisons, and for the government to raise the age of criminal responsibility to at least 14. We need to build homes and communities, not prisons. One thing that is welcome in this budget is the $500 million for the Renewable Energy Fund via CleanCo, as previously announced, and the $145 million for grid upgrades to create 3 renewable energy zones. But what is missing is a detailed and comprehensive strategy to build 100% publicly owned clean energy as quickly as possible. I can tell you one thing, you won't get there by approving new thermal, coal and gas projects. Getting to 50% renewables should be easy, and we could even get there with a target but no plan, as we have at the moment. But getting to 100% will need planning, especially to make sure the workers with good-paying jobs at coal power plants and coal mines in south-east and regional Queensland aren't left behind. Despite countless warnings that thermal, coal and gas are in decline, Labor and the LNP cling to these old, polluting industries, no doubt out of a sense of debt or obligation to the corporations funding their campaigns, and perhaps out of a misplaced attempt to reconnect with a working-class base that seems to be abandoning them all too quickly. What communities and workers across Queensland really deserve is honesty about the transition ahead, a plan for good, steady jobs, affordable housing, free education and healthcare to support them. But that's not the plan this budget supports. It's more useful to the retirement plans of millionaire bankers and coal CEOs than it is anything else. Turning briefly to national parks and protected areas, Acting Speaker, this budget delivers just $7.6 million per year, or $28 million over 4 years, to expand our national parks and other protected areas, which is well below the $135 million called for by the Queensland Conservation Council and only around 1/10 of the amount called for by other experts. And I'm referring there to the 2018 Queensland Treasury Corporation report, a report that the government tried to bury, that made clear that capital investment of $225 million would be required to reach even 13% of Queensland being in protected areas, and that this would require $25 to $80 million in annual funding for effective maintenance. The former Environment Minister, Enoch, described the sum that's been committed as an initial investment, a down payment. Well, how depressingly disappointing it is to now learn that the plan for the next 4 years includes no extra money. It's a down payment and no one's there to pick up the rest of the bill. It looks like we are nowhere near on track to meet the nationally agreed target of 17% for our protected areas here in Queensland. Bold investment to restore and protect biodiversity through expanding protected areas would be a brilliant way to keep people working as we recover from COVID. And it's more vital every year as climate change pushes more species to the brink. And I urge the government to increase this commitment. I was also pleased to hear yesterday that the government will not increase public transport fares in 2021, but I still marvel at the apparently purely ideological attachment to ticketing and fares. The total costs to the state government of delivering public transport in South East Queensland went up in this budget from $1.55 billion to $1.74 billion over the coming year. That's thanks to a drop in fare revenue due to COVID. Now, even before fare revenue dropped, the state government was already subsidising about 80% of every single trip, and now that figure would be far higher. That's before we consider the $371 million Labor are spending on a new privatised ticketing system. And now, considering both these things, the case is now even stronger for making public transport free, as the Greens proposed before the election. All told, it's actually cheaper for the government to make public transport free. We could save on the cost of ticketing, we could cut back on wasteful road widenings, we could cut pollution and transform our city in the process. I am very happy, Mr Acting Deputy Speaker, to see that the budget contains $65 million for a new school in Brisbane's Inner West, near my electorate. It is a wonderful feeling to stand here and say that after years of getting up in this place to explain why we need a new school to address overcrowding, the West Side's growing rapidly and we need long-term planning and infrastructure like schools to keep up. Now, one thing I'd note immediately is that while the commitment so far is just for a primary school, there's no denying we also need more secondary capacity. Ensuring that the community is involved in planning and heard in making decisions about the location of the school will be my priority over the next 2 years, and I'm looking forward to working with the department to help make this happen. The other crucial side of school overcrowding is outside school hours care, and right now capacity is not keeping up with demand. Too many parents are missing out, which affects their ability to work and their families' financial stability. Now, despite a pre-election commitment for more OSH funding at Indooroopilly and Ironside state schools, I couldn't see this in the budget papers, and I will be following up in estimates this coming week to make sure it's delivered as soon as possible and not delayed. There are a few other local projects funded in the budget I want to acknowledge here as well. The government has allocated $500,000 to redesign the Indooroopilly Shopping Centre bus station over the next 2 years. It will be important to make sure that this upgrade improves pedestrian access across Musgrave Road and Station Road. It's also great to see the state will be jointly funding the design of a shared path along Whitten Street in Indooroopilly near Ambrose Tracy College. This is a really important stretch to link up the new proposed Riverwalk at Indooroopilly and the Centenary Cycleway, so it's great to see that that's moving forward. I would, with more time, Mr Acting Speaker, like to address the failure again of this budget to address train station accessibility, particularly at the Taringa train station, which so desperately needs an upgrade. The absence of any funding, despite $244 million in funding for the Centenary Bridge duplication and motorway upgrades, we still see no funding to commit to build priority bus lanes along the motorway. Now, this is despite that being proposed in the Western Brisbane Transport Network strategy all the way back in 2009. I'm disappointed to see nothing in the budget for the state to work with Brisbane City Council to buy back the ABC site in Toowong and to help make those vitally important green bridges in inner Brisbane happen, but I'll keep making the case for that. In closing, Acting Speaker, and in general, long-term planning and big, bold ideas for Queensland's post-COVID future are hard to find in this budget. And when the government told us there would be no surprises in this budget, they weren't lying, but I almost wish they had offered just a few surprises. More of the same means more unemployment, more homelessness, more child poverty and inequality, while big banks, property developers and mining corporations get more profits and continue to run the show. This budget really is full of missed opportunities, and I'll avoid exhaustively recounting the Greens' election platform here again. You can read it all online if you want some more ideas. But just a few of those proposals, like 100,000 public homes, free school meals, 100% publicly owned clean energy, a local manufacturing revival and free public transport, these things would have transformed everyday Queenslanders' lives for the better. But to do that, this budget would have had to take on the big banks and mining corporations that run the state. And unfortunately, this budget reads more like a repayment of their investment in Labor this election than a budget for Queenslanders who are really struggling. Thank you.